The sun had set hours ago, leaving the village in a quiet darkness that was broken only by the faint flicker of small fires. In the heart of this village, a group of people huddled together, wrapped in thin blankets that offered little warmth. Against the cold wind, their faces were drawn with exhaustion and worry. Life had not been kind to them. For weeks, even months, they had faced hardships that seemed impossible to endure. Crops had failed, and the few animals they owned had grown, weak from lack of food. Water was scarce, and each day brought the fear of what would happen if they could not find enough to drink. Among them was a woman named Amina. She had once been full of life, always laughing and helping others, but the struggles had changed. Her eyes, however, still held a spark, a small flame of hope that refused to die. She had a child, a little boy named Sammy, who had not known the comfort of a steady meal for many days. Amina held him close as she whispered promises that she did not fully believe she could keep. She told him that things would get better, that somehow, someone, somewhere, would hear their cries. The people of the village had begun to speak in whispers when night fell. They did not dare speak too loudly. It felt as if the darkness itself was listening, as if the night had become alive with the weight of their worries. Yet even in the silence, they shared their thoughts and fears. They spoke of lost homes, of the few belongings they had managed to save, and of the long days spent searching for food. They spoke of dreams that had faded, and of laughter that had become a stranger in their lives. Despite all the hardships, there was a ritual that had formed among them. Each evening, after their meager meals, they would gather outside and look up at the sky. The stars shone like tiny lamps in the vast darkness, and the villagers would whisper to them as if the stars were capable of listening. Some spoke their hopes, some their regrets, and some their fears. They prayed not just for themselves but for the entire village, for everyone they had lost, and for the uncertain future that awaited them. Elderly men and women, who had lived through many hardships before, would join the children and young adults. They shared stories of times when the world seemed kinder, when help had arrived in unexpected ways. These stories were told not to bring sadness, but to remind the young ones that hope could exist even in the darkest of times. Children like Sami listened with wide eyes, imagining a world that seemed far away, a world where the skies might actually respond to the voices that called out to them. One night, as the wind rustled through the trees, Amina whispered a question that had been on her mind for many nights. "Do you think anyone is listening?" she asked softly, not expecting an answer. Yet the village held its breath, waiting as if the stars themselves might answer. Her words carried the weight of years of worry, the longing for something greater than the suffering that surrounded them. Her neighbors shook their heads gently, unsure how to respond. Some said that perhaps help would come, and others admitted quietly that they no longer believed in miracles. The youngest children held hands with each other, forming small circles on the ground. They had not yet learned to carry the burden of despair fully, and so their prayers were simple. They asked for food, for safety, for warmth. They did not yet understand the complex problems of the world, but they understood hunger and fear, and their voices rose together like tiny notes in a song that reached up to the heavens. Despite the sadness, there were moments of laughter. Someone would remember a funny story from the past, or a child would make a small joke, and for a brief time the heaviness of their lives lifted. Even the adults could not help but smile. These small sparks of joy reminded them of their humanity, of the fact that they were still alive and that they still cared for each other. In a world that seemed indifferent to their suffering, these little moments were precious treasures. The village had faced many trials, and each one had left scars, but it had also created a sense of unity. They relied on each other for support, sharing what little they had and helping those who were weaker or sicker. There was an unspoken rule that no one would be left completely alone. Every evening when the stars appeared, they did not just pray for themselves, they prayed for the entire village. They hoped that someone somewhere might hear their cries, might understand their pain, and might reach out a hand to help them in their time of need. As the night deepened, The sky seemed to stretch endlessly above them. The stars were bright, distant and beautiful, and yet they seemed so far away that hope felt fragile. Still, the villagers continued to speak to them. Some sang quietly, their voices trembling but determined. Some wrote notes on scraps of paper, messages of hope and desperation which they carefully tucked into small containers, imagining that someday, somehow, someone might find them. Amina held Sammy close, feeling his small heartbeat against her chest. She whispered to him stories of brave people who had faced impossible odds and had survived. She told him that even when the world seemed dark, there was always light to be found, sometimes in the smallest gestures, sometimes in the kindness of strangers, and sometimes, perhaps, in the stars above. She did not know if anyone was listening, but the act of speaking, of hoping, of sharing their dreams and fears gave them a sense of strength. The night grew colder, but the villagers remained outside for a little longer, staring at the sky. Each star became a symbol of their hope, each flicker a reminder that they were still alive, still believing that help could come. They cried softly, not in despair alone, but in a mixture of sorrow and hope, reaching out to something beyond their understanding. Though the world around them was harsh and unforgiving, in that moment they felt a connection to something larger than themselves, a quiet belief that perhaps, just perhaps, someone might answer their call. By the time the first light of dawn began to creep over the horizon, the villagers returned to their homes exhausted but somehow a little stronger. The night had been long and filled with uncertainty, but they had shared their fears, their hopes, and their prayers with the stars. Though the challenges of the day awaited them, they carried a tiny flame of hope, a reminder that even in the darkest times, reaching out, speaking their truth, and supporting each other could make life bearable. And in that hope, they found the courage to face another day. Days passed slowly in the village. Life was still hard, and the villagers continued their daily struggles to find enough food and water. Yet something had begun to change, subtle but powerful. Small signs of attention started to reach them, like distant ripples across a calm pond. One morning, a young boy named Sammy ran to Amina, holding a folded paper in his tiny hands. "Look, Mother, someone wrote something," he said with wide, excited eyes. Amina took the paper, her hands trembling. The words were simple but filled with kindness. It was from someone far away, someone who had heard of their struggles and wanted to help. The villagers were cautious at first. They had hoped for help many times before, but it never came. Messages had been lost, promises had been broken, and every disappointment had left them a little more skeptical. Still, reading those few lines of care made their hearts swell with something they had not felt in a long time: hope. Slowly, more letters arrived. Some were sent through organizations that worked quietly to support people in need. Others were simple notes, written by strangers who had seen their stories through photographs or short messages shared by travelers or journalists. With each letter, a small spark of excitement grew in the village. Amina read aloud to the children, explaining that someone, somewhere, had listened to their cries. "The world has not forgotten us," she whispered, her voice trembling. The children's faces lit up with smiles that seemed brighter than the morning sun. For a moment, the heaviness of their daily life lifted, replaced by a sense of possibility. Perhaps they were not alone in the world after all. The arrival of aid was slow at first. A few bundles of food, some clothing, and basic medical supplies reached the village. These items were not enough to solve all their problems, but they were a sign that someone cared. Elderly villagers carefully distributed the food, making sure that everyone received at least a little. The children eagerly helped unpack the bundles, their laughter ringing through the small streets, mixing with the quiet sighs of relief from the adults. The simplest things, a piece of bread, a warm blanket, became treasures. As the days went by, visitors from outside began arriving in the village. Some were volunteers, people who had dedicated their lives to helping those in need. Others were journalists, curious and compassionate, who wanted to share the story of this small village with the rest of the world. They asked questions gently, listened carefully, and offered small comforts that went beyond material aid. For the villagers who had spent so long feeling invisible, these gestures were deeply meaningful. They realized that their voices had traveled far beyond the hills and forests that surrounded them. Among the visitors was a teacher named Lena, who had traveled many miles to offer education to the children. She set up a small space where the children could gather each morning. With chalk and paper, she began teaching letters, numbers, and stories of hope. The children were curious and eager, absorbing everything like dry soil drinking rain. For the first time in months, the village had a sense of routine, a rhythm that was not dominated by fear and hunger. Learning became an adventure, and the children's laughter became a bridge to brighter days. Alongside education, medical workers arrived to treat the sick and injured. They brought medicines, clean water, and knowledge about hygiene. For those who had been suffering from minor illnesses due to malnutrition or unclean water, the difference was immediate. Amina noticed how Sammy's energy returned, how the little boy ran and played with other children without feeling constantly weak or tired. The villagers began to see that the help they had been praying for was real, not just a distant dream in the night sky. However, the village also had to adjust to these new arrivals. At first, there was uncertainty and fear. Could these visitors be trusted? Were they only passing through, leaving empty promises behind? Slowly, trust grew, built on consistent actions, kindness, and attention to their real needs. They began sharing stories, laughter, and even tears with the newcomers, realizing that their lives and struggles were being respected, not exploited. Amina and other adults in the village worked tirelessly to organize small projects with the volunteers. They repaired old buildings, cleaned water sources, and planted small gardens. Every task, no matter how simple, became a symbol of hope and resilience. Children joined in, learning the value of work, cooperation, and patience. They were taught that even small actions could bring meaningful change when people cared for each other. News of the village began to spread beyond their immediate region. Letters, photographs, and stories shared by journalists reached faraway places. Donations came from distant towns, and some organizations offered long-term support. The villagers were astonished that so many people cared, that their voices, which had once seemed swallowed by darkness, were now being heard. Every new gift, every kind word reinforced their belief that the world was larger and more compassionate than they had imagined. Even at night, when the stars appeared above them, the villagers felt a new connection. Their prayers to the sky were no longer just a desperate plea. They became expressions of gratitude and hope. They thanked the stars for reminding them that help could come, not from magic or miracles, but from the hearts of people who chose to act with kindness. Amina held Sammy in her arms one night as they looked up, pointing to the stars. "See, little one," she said softly. "Sometimes the stars send people instead of answers, and when they come, everything can change." The villagers began planning for the future in ways they had not dared to before. Small businesses were imagined, gardens expanded, and plans for schools and clinics became possible. They discussed new dreams quietly around their fires, realizing that the light at the end of their struggle might be closer than they had hoped. Hope, once fragile, was growing stronger. Yet even as the village celebrated these small victories, there was a quiet understanding that life was still unpredictable. They knew that help could not solve all problems immediately, and that challenges would continue to arise. But the difference now was that they were not alone. Their cries, once swallowed by silence, had reached the world, and though the darkness of uncertainty remained, they had learned that even in despair, human compassion could shine through, brighter than the faintest star. The nights became calmer, filled with the gentle hum of shared stories, laughter, and prayers. Children went to sleep with a sense of security they had not known for years. Adults felt the first real relief in months, discovering that hope, even when delayed, was never lost. They realized that their small village, once isolated and forgotten, was now connected to a world that cared, that listened, and that acted. By the end of Part 2, The villagers had learned an important truth. When voices rise in hope and desperation, they can reach beyond the borders of isolation. Their prayers, once meant only for the stars, had been answered in the form of real people who brought love, care, and tangible help. They still had much to face, but the first rays of a new day had arrived, illuminating the path ahead. The village had begun to breathe with new energy. The arrival of volunteers, teachers, and medical workers brought hope and relief. Gardens were being planted, children learned letters and numbers, and the villagers no longer feared each day as much as before. But just as hope was growing, a shadow appeared that no one had expected. Strangers began to arrive, people whose intentions were not clear. At first, they were polite, offering help and advice, carrying goods and talking in soft voices that seemed friendly. The villagers welcomed them cautiously, happy for any assistance. After months of hardship, it was easy to believe that anyone who came bearing gifts could be a friend. Amina and the other adults thought perhaps these newcomers were volunteers who had traveled far to help, just like the ones who had brought food and medicine before. But soon, the villagers began noticing odd things. The new arrivals seemed interested in more than just helping. They asked too many questions about supplies, about the village's little stores of food, and about where people went when they left the village. Their smiles were too practiced, their words carefully chosen. Amina watched them quietly, feeling a strange unease she could not put into words. It was as if the warmth of hope they had felt was now accompanied by a cold shadow of caution. The first small problems began to appear. A bundle of food that had been delivered to the village was gone by the morning, and no one knew who had taken it. Amina noticed that some visitors lingered in the areas where children played or where people stored important belongings. The villagers started whispering to one another, sharing suspicions they had tried to ignore at first. They did not want to believe it, but slowly, the truth became harder to avoid. Not everyone who had come to their village came with kindness in their hearts. Some of these new arrivals were clever. They used polite words and gentle gestures to make people trust them. They offered help, but in ways that benefited themselves, more than the villagers. They suggested unnecessary projects or asked for resources, and when villagers complied, those resources quietly disappeared. What had once seemed like a simple act of generosity now carried shadows of greed. Even the most optimistic villagers could not ignore it any longer. The children were not aware of the full danger, but they sensed tension. Sammy noticed the adults whispering late at night, their voices low and anxious. The village's laughter became quieter, more cautious. Amina tried to shield her son from worry, speaking softly and telling him stories of courage and cleverness, reminding him that even in tricky situations, people could find ways to protect themselves. She wanted him to understand that the world had both light and shadow, and that recognizing the shadow was the first step to keeping it at bay. Despite the challenges, the villagers refused to surrender their hope. They continued to welcome the volunteers they trusted, the teachers and medical workers who had proven themselves, and the neighbors who had stood by them through the worst days. They learned to distinguish between those who genuinely cared and those who sought only advantage. Every day became a lesson in caution, patience, and understanding human nature. The new monsters, as the villagers had begun to think of them, tested the community in many ways. They tried to manipulate disputes, offering advice or rewards, to create division. They took opportunities to exaggerate minor mistakes or misplace small resources, hoping to make the villagers doubt each other. For a time, suspicion grew, and even old friends questioned each other. But slowly, the village began to unite against these subtle threats. People learned to speak openly, share observations, and support one another. They discovered that vigilance, combined with trust in those who had proven themselves, could overcome uncertainty. Amina noticed a change in herself as well. The fear that had once held her back began to transform into determination. She started keeping careful notes of who did what, sharing information with other adults and quietly teaching the children about awareness without frightening them. Sammy, even at his young age, began learning small lessons in responsibility, like helping to watch over the little garden plots and making sure food was stored safely. The village learned that hope alone was not enough. They had to pair it with wisdom. Interestingly, the challenges posed by these opportunists also strengthened the village in unexpected ways. People who had felt helpless discovered courage. The HFY elderly shared their experience advising younger adults on how to notice deception. Friends who had drifted apart during the hardships grew closer, realizing that unity was the strongest defense. Even the children, who once only played and studied, began helping in practical ways, learning lessons about fairness, honesty, and alertness. The village held meetings at night, sometimes by candlelight or near the flickering fires. They discussed what had happened and planned how to protect themselves in the future. Instead of being paralyzed by fear, they began to act collectively, creating rules for fair sharing, organizing watches for their supplies, and agreeing to check carefully before accepting gifts or advice. They realized that danger was not always loud or visible. Sometimes it was subtle, hidden behind smiles and polite words. Despite the tension, life continued. The garden grew slowly but surely. Children attended lessons, and the sick received care from trusted medical workers. The villagers learned to balance hope with caution, to celebrate small victories while remaining aware of possible setbacks. Even as the monsters walked among them, the villagers refused to let despair dominate. They knew that danger existed, but they also knew that together, they could face it without losing their spirit. Amina, standing outside one evening with Sammy, looked at the stars above. She had once whispered to them asking for help, and now she realized that the real challenge was not only to receive help, but to protect the goodness that had come into their lives. The monsters of the earth were real, but so was their courage, their unity, and their wisdom. The stars, she thought, were still there, shining quietly, reminding them that even in a world with darkness there was light to guide the way. By the end of this chapter of their story, the villagers had learned an important truth. The world could bring both kindness and cunning, and it was their responsibility to recognize the difference. They had discovered that real strength came not only from hope and generosity, but also from careful thought, courage, and working together. Even in the presence of deception and selfishness, the village began to thrive in a new way, wiser, more alert, and more united than ever. Though challenges remained, they no longer felt powerless. The lessons of trust, caution, and resilience had become part of their daily lives. They learned that monsters might walk among them, but courage, unity, and vigilance could ensure that these shadows never overcame the light they had found. The village had grown stronger and wiser after the lessons of trust and caution. Yet the challenges that came with opportunists, the monsters of the earth, were not easy to overcome. Every day required careful thought, teamwork, and courage. The villagers quickly realized that surviving difficulties was not just about receiving help. It was about organizing themselves and protecting what they had worked so hard to build. Amina became one of the quiet leaders of the village. She coordinated small groups to watch over resources, organize deliveries, and make sure children were safe and educated. Each evening, she held meetings with the other adults, reviewing the day's events and planning for the next. These gatherings were filled with serious conversation, but also laughter and encouragement. Everyone knew that cooperation and trust in each other would help them face any challenges. Sammy, though still a young boy, played his part as well. He helped with the little garden, making sure water reached the plants, carrying small baskets of food, and learning how to observe carefully, without creating panic. The children of the village, inspired by his example, began to take pride in helping in small but meaningful ways. They learned that even small actions could make a big difference when done with care and responsibility. The volunteers and teachers continued to support the village, but now they were joined by people who taught more than just basic skills. Some offered lessons on teamwork, problem-solving, and planning for the future. Others helped the villagers build stronger shelters, repair water systems, and improve gardens to produce more food. The villagers were no longer passive recipients of aid. They were active participants in shaping their own lives. Challenges, however, continued to appear. Some of the opportunists tried to manipulate villagers against one another, but the lessons in vigilance and trust paid off. Adults calmly addressed conflicts, listening carefully to everyone's side before making decisions. Children were guided gently to understand fairness, responsibility, and honesty. The village slowly created a system where everyone's voice was heard and valued, reducing the power of those who sought to cause confusion. One morning, Amina noticed that some supplies meant for the school and the medical center had gone missing. Rather than panic, she gathered a small group of adults and calmly investigated. They observed patterns, asked questions discreetly, and eventually identified the source. Instead of reacting with anger, they approached the situation with fairness and understanding. The person responsible had acted out of ignorance, not malice, and was guided back to help rather than hinder the village. This careful and wise approach strengthened the community even further. Children like Sammy watched closely. They were learning that life was not only about joy or hardship, but also about making choices. They understood that mistakes could happen, but that honesty, courage, and working together could solve problems. Even when challenges came from unexpected directions, the village remained resilient, proving that the strength of a community was built on trust, courage, and education. The garden projects expanded, teaching the villagers self-sufficiency. Volunteers shared techniques for growing more food, conserving water, and keeping plants healthy. Adults and children worked side by side, creating a rhythm of cooperation that brought the village together. Even when rains were delayed or supplies were limited, they learned to adapt, sharing ideas and resources freely. Their lives were no longer just about survival. They were about growth, learning, and preparing for a brighter future. Education became a pillar of the village's strength. Lena, the teacher, introduced not only reading and writing but also lessons in problem-solving, leadership, and creativity. Children discovered they could dream beyond the village, imagining futures where they could make positive change for themselves and others. Every small success, every seed planted, and every page written in a notebook became a symbol of resilience and hope. Amina often reflected on how far they had come. The people who once whispered their prayers to the stars were now strong enough to face challenges on their own. They had learned to recognize danger, respond wisely, and support one another in ways that even the best intentions from outsiders could not teach. The village had transformed, not only surviving adversity but growing stronger because of it. Evenings were now filled with storytelling, music, and laughter, alongside the serious discussions about how to manage the village. The stars still shone above, but they were no longer a distant symbol of unreachable help. Instead, the stars reminded them of the journey they had taken, from fear and helplessness to knowledge, unity, and courage. Their prayers had been answered in an unexpected way, through the people who cared, and through the strength they discovered in themselves. By the end of this period, the village had learned a powerful lesson. Life could bring both kindness and deception, but with courage, teamwork, and careful thinking, even the trickiest challenges could be overcome. The villagers had found that real strength came from within, from their willingness to protect each other, to learn, and to act with fairness and determination. Their community was no longer fragile. It was resilient, ready to face whatever came next. Time moved forward, and the village continued to flourish. The people had faced hardship, discovered hope, and learned to protect themselves against those who might take advantage of them. They had grown stronger, wiser, and more united than they had ever imagined possible. The lessons they had learned about courage, trust, and vigilance had become part of their daily lives. The village's small gardens were now thriving, producing enough food for everyone. The children's laughter filled the air as they played, studied, and explored. Amina watched Sammy running with his friends, a smile lighting up her face. She remembered the nights when they had huddled together, whispering to the stars in desperation, and marveled at how far they had come. Their prayers, it seemed, had been answered, not by miracles from above, but by the strength and kindness of people on earth, and by the resilience they had discovered within themselves. Education became central to the community. Children attended school regularly, and adults took lessons in practical skills, teamwork, and leadership. The villagers realized that learning was a lifelong process, and that knowledge could help them protect their community and build a better future. The teacher, Lena, continued to inspire them, encouraging curiosity and creativity in every child. The children dreamed of careers that could bring more good into the world, inspired by the help they had received and the struggles they had overcome. Healthcare improved too. With trusted medical workers visiting regularly, people stayed healthier and stronger. Small problems were treated before they became serious, and the community learned basic practices for hygiene and wellness. Even the elderly, who had once been worried about illness and fatigue, now felt stronger and safer. The village had become a place where life could flourish, rather than just survive. Over time, the villagers also learned to help others beyond their own community. They shared their knowledge, food, and resources with neighboring villages, creating a network of mutual support. Amina often spoke to the children about this, explaining that kindness and courage could multiply when shared. They realized that their experiences, though difficult, had prepared them to be leaders in a wider world. Evenings in the village became celebrations of life. People shared stories of the past, of challenges they had faced, and of the small victories that had built their strength. Music, laughter, and song became common, blending with the gentle hum of the wind through trees. These moments reminded everyone that even in the darkest times, joy could exist, and that happiness was worth protecting and sharing. Amina often reflected on the journey of the village. They had cried out to the stars for help, but the world had answered in its own way. The monsters of the earth had tested them, but they had learned courage, vigilance, and unity. And in the end, it was not the challenges or the difficulties that defined them. It was how they had responded, together, with wisdom and care. Sammy had grown too, learning lessons about responsibility, fairness, and leadership. He had watched adults act with courage, and he had learned that even small actions could create big change. The village had become a living example of how resilience, cooperation, and hope could transform lives. Children and adults alike were inspired to continue building, learning, and caring for each other, ensuring that their community would remain strong for generations to come. As the sun set each evening, the villagers would sometimes gather quietly and look at the stars. This time their prayers were not of desperation but of gratitude. They thanked the sky for guiding them, for reminding them of hope, and for inspiring courage in their hearts. They understood that while the universe did not always answer directly, it could inspire human beings to act, and through human kindness and wisdom, miracles of a different kind could happen. By now, the village had become a symbol of resilience. People from far away sometimes visited, learning how a small group of ordinary villagers had faced incredible challenges and emerged stronger. Their story inspired others, showing that even when the world seems harsh, kindness, courage, and unity could overcome adversity. Amina looked at Sammy one evening, watching him share a smile with his friends. She